If you are going to be tweeting about any of this, I want one more reminder. Let's do it at NPF Widening. We want to let people know exactly what's going on in this setting and the movement that we're starting, if you will. But if you had been sitting at the dining table with me and my part of the crew, you would have, first of all, learned about the power of relationships and networking and staying in touch with people. Because Debra reminded me today that she started at the Detroit Free Press 30 years ago today. So let's give her a round of applause. And you were on the Metro desk?
You don't have to tweet that, though. We're gonna let that
but I'm going to see if you give me applause, because I started a month before she did. And so through the years, following each other's journey, when I got back from East Africa, the reason I got to do my first piece for National Geographic was because Deborah Adams Simmons was the executive editor for history and culture there. And she looked around the newsroom and said, surely there has to be someone with melanin in their skin who can write about some of these issues. And so that's how my relationship with Nat Geo began. But that's how I got to watch how one woman's influence, presence in a newsroom can literally redefine the narrative. I chose that title for your speech, by the way, because Deborah's being at at National Geographic has transformed coverage in so many different ways, from the race issue to Tulsa Massacre coverage to Into the Depths, the latest issue. So I'm excited to hear, first of all, Debra says she wants to start, and I want her to start, by talking about her early journey in journalism. So why don't we start there, Debra?
Good evening. I look forward to getting to know you all. I had some fantastic conversation over dinner, and I hope that conversation can continue. And really, I have like 2 hours worth of information that we're gonna try to squeeze into an hour. But I think it would be appropriate for me to talk about the beginning of my National Geographic journey, and then have you all do a little interactive exercise so the conversation after dinner isn't dry. And then I want to talk about my background, National Geographic today, and then leave you with some words of wisdom. So in 2015, 2016, I did a Neiman Fellowship because I was kind of, stressed about the transition to digital really changed a lot of news organizations in ways that haven't necessarily been good. As digital newsrooms began to make the same mistakes as legacy newsrooms in terms of diversity, in terms of content. And some of the news organizations that I was working for were focused on cop briefs as clickbait rather than sort of meaningful journalism. And so really, I think I probably was having a midlife journalism crisis, and I decided to do a Neiman for a year. At the end of my Neiman, I spent some time working with the Knight Foundation and the Ford Foundation reimagining the local news ecosystem, trying to figure out what approaches should we take? How can we stem the tide of some of these bad decisions? And while I was doing that work, I got a phone call from an old friend, speaking of relationships, who was the editor of National Geographic, who said, I want to do this project, but I need your help. And I said, okay, what is it? And she was like, I need you to come to DC so we can talk about this project. And Susan Goldberg, who was then National Geographic's editor, had decided that she wanted to do an issue on race, but she didn't have the right people in the room. And I said, well, who's in the room? And it was Susan and 5 white guys. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to make the trip to DC. You don't have enough of the right people in the room. And I was just gonna be a consultant for several months. Several months has turned into 5 years. Susan has left Nat Geo, I'm still there. And every day we are thinking about what are the stories we're telling, who gets to tell those stories, and how are we telling those stories. In spite of the noise, in spite of the criticism, what have you, we've amassed a fabulous team internally and with external contributors like Rachel that's really changing the face of National Geographic. So perhaps in this presentation, I'll get to a deck that I have that actually looks at Nat Geo today more specifically, but there's so many good things that I think it would be appropriate to talk about today that I might have to race through the deck, or we may not be able to spend a lot of time on it. But to make this interactive, I'd like each of you to think about your own experiences with race and write down 6 words that come to mind. And it could be your daily experience, it could be your global perspective. Like, what are the 6 words that you think about? And I'm asking you to do this because in 2021, we did a story with Michelle Norris on the Race Card Project, where during the past 10 years, more than 500,000 people have sent in the cards explaining or describing what their experiences with race have been. And Michelle started this project because she felt like race is an uncomfortable topic that people don't like to talk about, and this would be kind of an easy way in, but she wasn't sure what kind of response she would get. And she's been overwhelmed by the cards that she has gotten. And they're mostly personal, people's personal experiences that they experience in their daily lives, conversations that they have with people in their own households that really has been transformative for her. And so, does anyone want to share what your 6 words are? And as you're thinking about it, no pressure. Did you have your hand up? As you're thinking about it, I want to. I'm just gonna.
If you need somebody, but I did not raise my hand.
Can you see?
We're not all strong Black women. What bothered me so much about the popular phrase, strong Black woman, was it left out considerate, reflective, deliberate, and patient. Who I am is not just a strong Black woman frowning and forging through life like a checklist. It's not my duty to feign strength or self-righteousness, but to turn my experiences into empathy.
He's my dad, not the partner.
I went back to school as an adult, and a classmate happened to be looking over my shoulder at a picture on my computer. It was a picture of the house where I grew up with my dad out front pulling weeds, and she squinted at the picture and she said, "And was that your gardener?" My dad probably would have laughed and said yes, because he did do most of the gardening at our house. But I was not able to laugh off that, and I've never been able to laugh off the assumptions people make about who my dad is to me. So even if it makes someone else uncomfortable to say, "He's my dad, not the gardener," I can live with their discomfort, but I can't live with the idea of the guy in the picture being thought of as something other than my dad.
I am not an exotic creature. Just walking out in the world, I always felt like I was being observed differently than other people because of my ambiguous appearance. Before people would even ask my name, they would say, "What are you? What's your ethnicity? Where are you from?" When I was just simply walking down the street or ordering food at a restaurant or sitting in a movie theater, people would just come up to me and ask me that, and it really made me feel like I was not human. And it led to confusion about my own mixed race identity of being Japanese and Black. For me personally, I have 2 very strong ethnicities or cultures that are constantly telling me you need to be proud of yourself.
With kids and dad, a little thug. The thought came to me as I examined how I was treated in Pacific Grove when I didn't have the safety shield of my biracial kids and my European wife, I have noticed that walking around Pacific Grove, I was treated one way when I had the comfort of my wife and kids with me. But during the summers, my wife and kids would go to Germany for approximately 6 to 8 weeks. When I was alone walking around Pacific Grove, just going to certain stores or different places around, I was treated very differently when I was by myself. People just sort of were wondering, what was I doing in their neighborhood?
So some of the 6 words we got from this were heartbreaking. One black woman wrote, "I wish he was a girl," about her son because of the challenges in the community where they live. I was going to go through the story, but I do have a copy of this Tulsa issue, which is in the back. The actual story that you can read, the print version of the story is here. But part of the reason I showed this was to show that, the multi-platform storytelling that we're doing. There's an extensive print story in the magazine. There's the National Geographic video that we just looked at. Michelle has done a podcast that goes with this work. And there will be several stories that we talk about tonight, including Into the Depths, that plays out on even more layers. Some of you heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre because last year was the 100th anniversary. So we did a story on Tulsa. National Geographic Television did a documentary, and I'm going to play a clip from that. We did a multi-part podcast. National Geographic has a separate magazine called History Magazine. We did stories there. And one of the young people on the staff we've hired several young people on the staff post George Floyd. One of the young men who we hired discovered that he was a Tulsa descendant, and his great-great-great-grandfather owned the hotel in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, and he unraveled his whole personal family journey that became a big national story. So again, this all falls into what are the stories we're telling, giving voice to people who've never been able to tell their story, particularly in a publication like National Geographic. How are we telling those stories, and what kind of difference can we make? And so that's the work that I'm doing 30 years into my career. So now I will backtrack. I attended Syracuse University. Any Syracuse alum in here? I majored in broadcast journalism and political science. I was planning to go to law school, but I was going to take a year off and then go to law school. And I got this postgraduate internship at the daily newspaper in Syracuse. And it was supposed to be 9 months, which was going to be great. I was going to do my 9 months. I was going to take 3 months to sort of travel. And then I was going to start law school the following fall. 2 weeks into the internship, the paper offered me a full-time permanent job. And that was 30 plus years ago. I never made it to law school. I'm still here. I worked at the Syracuse Herald Journal, and then I moved to the Hartford Courant, which was my hometown newspaper. Worked in Hartford for a couple years, and then I went to the Detroit Free Press. And I did 2 tours at the Detroit Free Press. And really, I have been in a mentoring role for this entire time for 30 years. Jamil Hill was my high school apprentice. You remember that when Jamil was a baby? Yeah. And so back to the point about relationships, the relationships that you're making here today really are relationships that will stay with you. I left Detroit and went to the Virginian Pilot because that was an opportunity for me to move into management. Detroit at the time had hundreds of people working at the paper. Things aren't so much like that today. and print publications. And that was the beginning of my management career. And then I left Norfolk and went to the Akron Beacon Journal, which was a Knight Ridder newspaper, the same as the Detroit Free Press. And the editor of the San Jose Mercury News was a sister editor because we worked for the same parent company. And so several years after arriving in Akron, Knight Ridder was acquired, and that editor in San Jose became the editor in Cleveland. Well, Akron and Cleveland are about 40 minutes apart. She called and said, hey, would you consider being my managing editor in Cleveland? She had tried to get me to come to San Jose, but it was so expensive. I was like, no, I can't afford to live in California. And so I went to work with her at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Well, this is the same editor who I mentioned at the beginning of the story who ultimately became the editor of National Geographic. So this relationship with her had spanned 20 years before we got to the point, that we got to 5 years ago. So that was the path that I took. There are a lot of details in between, a lot of challenges along the journey. But ultimately, when Susan Goldberg left the Detroit Free Press in 2010, I was her replacement. At that time, I was the only Black woman editor of a metropolitan American newspaper. And so when I look at 2022, and I look at the 6 Black women who have become editors of newspapers, essentially digital newspapers, it's really gratifying, but it has taken a long time to get to this point. Interestingly enough, Mindy Marquez was named the editor at the Miami Herald right around the same time. And so Mindy and I were like in the trenches together. And so when I see you all in programs like this, really I feel like, my generation sort of, is passing the torch, and we're really depending on you because you are the you're going to write or lead the coverage that gives us the sort of first draft of history. And so much of what we're doing now is about uncovering buried truths because there weren't journalists who told the stories. Like, why did so many people learn about Tulsa in 2020 and 2021 at the 100th anniversary, or from a television show a couple years ago? That should have been history that had already been told. And so, that's some of the work we're doing. I know you have a bunch of questions.
No, I was just going to add on to that. Why is it shocking for many people that Black people scuba dive? Why so many of the topics that you've been able to elicit coverage for has just been questions that could have been asked and should have been asked, or at least considered possible. But I wanted to ask, does anyone want to share their 6 words?
Hello, my name is Rafael Carranza. I write for the Arizona Republic. My 6 words are historic, systemic, discomfort, blowback, ignorance, and diversity.
My name's Acacia, and I'm with WTOP News, based here in the DMV region. And I put tough, proof, attention, forefront, one, and necessary, and I added a little bonus word, and I've just put pain. And I know that's like all over the place, but there's reasons I won't give because we're short on time.
See, if we had more time, I would really want people to talk about their...
Yeah.
I'm Jennifer Solis. I'm a reporter for the Nevada Current. For my 6 words, I picked immigration, joy, struggle, poverty, culture, and strength.
Laura, you said only if you were picked on, so.
I didn't want to speak up, but I put not from here nor there, which in Spanish is ni de aquí ni de allá, because I am a mix of someone who is neither from one country, or associates with one country more than another and doesn't fit what I look like, I guess, is the bottom line of that. Please, somebody.
Gabrielle Settles from PolitiFact. I wrote important, divisive, acknowledged, embraced, empathy and empowering. I think when it comes to divisive, it comes from people who don't understand why we cover race, and they want to give the blowback. I think somebody said, you use blowback as one of your words, right? So that's where I put divisive, but then I feel acknowledged and embraced in my own community, whether that's from my community of, coworkers or of journalists, and empathetic from those who may not be people of color, but they can empathize and understand that, there are issues. I'll stop talking.
I've got one that's sort of based on the presentation format, and it took me a long time to feel this way in a way, but it's like, I have finally earned my blackness. And I say that because it took me turning 60 to have a sense of authentic power in what I've accomplished, what I'm able to do in terms of supporting others in my field, in doing something positive in this world. But when I think of the price was paid for me to write for National Geographic, to live in Kenya for 10 years, to do so many of the things that I've done, I feel it was conferred on me through the price or the process of others. And so, as I've told several people, Deborah, my mother was a maid, and she used to bring National Geographics home from the white family's house. So it's quite a journey I've been on, but continue.
So one of the stories that Rachel told at our dinner table that I think would be good for this group to hear is, we've talked about relationships, but there was a specific example where National Geographic was doing an issue on modern medicine, and it was an issue that didn't have any particular diversity. And Susan and I felt like maternal mortality, both in the US and around the world, would be a great story for us to include in the issue. So even though I hadn't talked to Rachel in maybe 10 years, I knew that she was back in the US. So I got in touch with a mutual friend to sort of figure out how to get in touch with her, and said, Rachel, we really want to do this story on maternal mortality, and I think you'd be a great person to write it. We'd like to include some African women and African experiences in the story. And then what happened next, Rachel?
So I got that's for the other story. No, so I was in Charlotte living with my best friend, and when she first sent me the email, it felt like this has got to be a joke, right? She wants me to write for National Geographic. I didn't believe it. But as the process progressed and I received a contract, I thought, okay, well, this must really be happening. And she connected me with the photographer, Lindsay Adario. This amazing woman. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of her.
So if anyone saw the picture of the Ukrainian family that was deceased in the streets about a week and a half ago, that was on the front page of the New York Times, that photograph was taken by Lindsay.
So that experience alone, working with her, probably catapulted me into the stratosphere in terms of perception and going into a reporting experience and being aware of everything around you. But when Lindsay was the one who recommended Edna Adan Ismail, the woman in Somaliland. And so I've been telling people this, and maybe you can confirm it. How many African American women have reported internationally for National Geographic?
Rachel, that might be you.
And like Ray, I don't say that to brag. I say that, my God, this is a 133-year-old publication. And so, yeah, it feels surreal for me to even say that, but power of connection, power of mentoring and networking. But what I tell people about Deborah is her innate sort of understanding of the need to bring people along. You cannot do it by yourself, or once you see the opportunity to offer someone else an opportunity to do this. The power that invests you with when someone makes that offer to you. Because before she sent me that email, I would have never even considered that I could do this, or I would do it, or would have an opportunity to do it. Once she did, 3 years later, I'm a contributor for National Geographic, and I get to do it every now and then, and it's incredible.
And then the other thing I mentioned at the table is the next story I called Rachel about was like, Rachel, can you go to the DRC? Because we need a story on Ebola. And despite the risk, Rachel, who was in Africa, came back to the US, got the necessary paperwork together, and then made a trip to the DRC.
Flew into Goma, and from Goma took a UNHCR plane to Beni and traveled around and went to the hospitals and saw patients and came back. Just, incredible experiences.
If anybody wants to read the story, there's some copies of the issue that has Tulsa also has the Race Card Project story. If you want to read the story, it's back there. I didn't bring 30, but there are probably 20 copies because I didn't want anybody to feel obliged to have to carry these magazines. But this one particularly gutted me. Grandma sent $100 when we broke up, and that was somebody whose grandmother didn't like the fact that she was sort of, in an interracial relationship. And so Grandma's response was to send her $100 when they broke up. I am dead to my father. Somebody else who is open-minded. This person happened to be gay, and his father has disowned him from the family. Held at gunpoint, will try anyway. And we have these sprinkled throughout, and some of them are just so gut-wrenching. But this was a really powerful story for us. So I don't know if anybody else wants to share theirs, but Michelle Norris's goal has been to get people to talk about their most intimate feelings, which is something that we tend not to do because we don't like to be vulnerable. Had the pandemic not happened, we were talking about a physical exhibit in the National Geographic Museum. And the next steps for this project are being determined, both as it relates to Michelle's relationship with National Geographic, as well as the Race Card Project itself, which is a body of work that she has been working on for a long time. And there's a whole other conversation we could get into about National Geographic explorers and who gets to become an explorer. The explorers are also increasingly diverse. And there's several tracks of Explorer, and one of those tracks is Storyteller. And so if you look at the current issue of National Geographic, where Tara Roberts is on the cover, she is a storytelling fellow. So she is an explorer whose job it is to tell stories. And so to Rachel's point about me having some influence over the stories we're telling, I'm in the room trying to make sure, first, I'm trying to make sure enough diverse applicants even raise their hand to take advantage of the storytelling fellowships. And then I'm in the room pushing to make sure an inclusive process happens and a diverse group of storytellers get selected. And so we're still now seeing the stories from storytellers who were selected in 2020, because they have a couple years to pull their projects together. So at this stage of my career, I'm really focused on amplifying the voices of underrepresented people and to providing support to your generation to make sure that that first draft of history gets written in the most inclusive way possible. And so I want to go through, this keeps going off. I'm going to ask Rachel another question while I get my computer back on. And then I want to just go through a quick deck that looks at some of Nat Geo's work more broadly. Some of that work is diverse, and some of it's animals, and some of it's, because that's one of our priorities, and some of it's amazing photography. And the one thing I would say, when I get to the tips part, I'm going to talk a lot about preparation. And we often can't find people who want to write about animals. I looked all over to find a diverse person who wanted to write about animals. And even though we couldn't find any, writers, we did find some scientists of color who are doing animal research, and because figuring out who the voices of the experts are in the work also matters. And so you'll see some of that work momentarily. Does anybody have any questions?
People at my table had, Brittany, come on now.
All right, well, while you're working through your questions, I'm just going to go through some of this quickly. So this is kind of what we think about Nat Geo. This is what people... And that's real, and that's kind of current. That happened, and this is sort of, you know, some people's sort of nostalgic sort of memory of National Geographic. You know, I meet so many people who say, "Oh my God, I have Nat Geos in my attic or in my basement." We're like, we don't want them in your basement. We want to be relevant now, though we appreciate that. But it was interesting, when I went to Nat Geo, there were so many stories from colleagues who said, wow, this is my dream assignment. I always wanted to work here. Did you, you know, when I was being interviewed for something, and the reporter said, did you always want to work here? And I was like, you know, that wasn't my experience. So for people who have issues with Nat Geo's past, you know, we see you, we hear you. You know, we're real. I live that. I get that. But when there's more current criticism about National Geographic, I'm like, would you call me first? So one organization did a critical story of us and didn't call. And so that's just journalistic malpractice. And I think it would have been appropriate. I would have said, you know, since 2020, we've done 150 digital stories about diverse people around the world. And here are the links. Rachel has written some of them. One of those stories was about a group of historians that are trying to chronicle all of the information from the sort of slavery ledgers to help people connect with their past, because right now we hit this 1870, African Americans hit this 1870 wall, and most families can't go back farther than that, but this work is trying to connect the dots.
Is what it's called. Enslaved.org.
So, you know, every story isn't a cover story. Some stories are much smaller than that. And I know we've talked a lot about, you know, we talked a lot about African Americans, but this is not just African Americans. It's Native Americans, it's Asian Americans. I'm going to click on some of those links as well. But right now I'm going to go through the deck just to tell you what's happening at Nat Geo. You know, we've gotten 3 Pulitzer finalists since 2018, 10 National Magazine Awards, which is essentially the Pulitzers of magazines. We were the Webby Media Company of the Year in 2020. We did a special issue on gender in 2017, which is probably the most controversial issue National Geographic has ever done. Tens of thousands of people canceled their subscriptions. We didn't care. We thought this was an important story to tell. We did a story on this young lady in the middle, Katie Stubblefield, who had to get a face transplant after her boyfriend shot her in the face. And this picture on the right is a picture from Indonesia, and this is a person who died of COVID. And these 3 stories were the 3 Pulitzer finalists, which is why I'm showing these here. This is just to make the point that National Geographic has a global reach. These are countries around the world where there's an issue of Nat Geo. Each of the local language editions can either run the cover story that we have, or they can run another cover story. Sometimes it's a different story from that same issue of the magazine. Sometimes they might run something that ran previously that they held back because they wanted to put it on the cover. But this is just to give you a small picture of our global reach. This is a reflection of how we consume news, right? It's sort of all mobile all the time. This picture was taken in Tokyo because I sent a writer to walk Tokyo from one end to the other. Tokyo is the largest city in the world, most populous city in the world. And so he spent a summer walking across Tokyo. This is to just give you a sense of our global reach. National Geographic on Instagram is the largest media company, and we, as of November, we're right between Khloe Kardashian and who is that, Taylor Swift, and rising. But to be a media company in that, with the number of followers that these people have, really speaks to how the brand really is modernizing. The National Geographic photographers have access to the Instagram account, and so there are many, many people who look at our Instagram daily who are enchanted with the digital side of the organization, who've never sort of opened the magazine, and we understand that. This picture sort of leans into some of the work we do. This person was the caretaker for this northern white rhino, which was the last of this species to exist, and he passed away. And that picture that I just showed was the Instagram version that ran first because that was urgent. We came back with a magazine issue. I mentioned to somebody earlier, one of the challenges of working in magazines after you've worked in sort of daily news for a long time is that magazines are slow. So we are working on the July issue of the magazine right now. So on the magazine side, we're trying to figure out the July issues, while on the daily side, we are covering urgent stories as they happen in real time. Again, this is how we're telling stories at Nat Geo. We're reframing the stories we tell and who gets to tell them. And we believe in the power of storytelling to change the world. So we try to find optimism. Did you find any optimism in the maternal mortality story? What Rachel did find was Black women who were working to bring attention to this issue, who were forming coalitions, who were creating organizations to provide additional support. So
I call them reproductive justice warriors. Mm-hmm. They all across America. For communities of color, poor, low-income mothers, the work they do is astonishing.
So I talked about acting urgently. It's kind of a dance, right? We got the sort of, what are we putting up the next hour? What's the big story for this week? And then what's going to be in the October issue of the magazine? Though we have broken news. We broke the story about their no scientific evidence that the coronavirus was actually made in a Chinese lab. We did this amazing story. We have an amazing science team who did probably one of Nat Geo's biggest stories ever on what the coronavirus does to the body. And this story ran kind of early in the pandemic. And of course, that picture is just healthcare workers is just wrenching. Again, these are exhausted healthcare workers, and this was a story about whether or not you should mix and match vaccines. So some of the stories that we do as daily stories try to answer the questions that people have. National Geographic here leaned into its expertise in mapping and cartography, which is part of Nat Geo's DNA. And again, this is Instagram. So these pictures are 2020. They're a combination of pandemic and protest. The young men on the top right are high school graduates in Minneapolis, a couple of days after George Floyd was murdered, and they're holding up their diplomas as an act of defiance. Down on the bottom left, there was a woman who was afraid to in New York City, who was afraid to go to the hospital to have her baby because this was at the point when COVID was surging in New York, and so she had her baby at home, and a Nat Geo photographer was there for that full experience. And this middle picture here is a different version of that picture I showed a little while ago of the Indonesian person who was with COVID, who was wrapped in what looks like saran wrap. So we had a conversation earlier about how does Nat Geo react for the magazine. So if we're 4 months ahead, it's kind of hard to react in real time. One of the things we did in 2020 was rip up a magazine that was finished to do a special issue of the magazine that was focused on the pandemic. These are just some of the covers that we've done related to healthcare, which is one of our areas of expertise. This is a story that we've done on, will COVID be here forever? Again, one of those questions that people have. And then make a difference is one of our core values. And so some of you may recall a story that we did a couple years ago on the impact of plastics. We made it, we depend on it, we're drowning in it. Really, this story was a call to action to try to inspire people to do better and be better. Here are some of the images from that story. Just really breathtaking photography, which is what National Geographic is known for.
As I said, I know there are some burning questions.
Okay, the one thing I want to say about this fight for clean air, so I talked about having some difficulty finding diverse journalists who are interested in animals. At one point, we were having the same challenge as it relates to environmental justice. Like the idea of climate change was not attractive to a lot of people we've approached. Now, I think the tide is turning on that. I think people see it as an important issue, but they're not necessarily trying to, some people don't think it's sexy. And so one of the things we're doing is trying to identify diverse contributors who can develop some expertise in this work. And this is the issue that I referenced. It's the issue that the Tulsa story is in. The Race Card Project story is in this issue. This was the June 2021 issue. It was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. We wanted to do something special with the cover, so we had Kadir Nelson paint a cover. Follow him on Instagram or Twitter. He's an amazing artist. When we're not being taped, we can talk about some of the sort of internal challenges to getting some of these kinds of things.
Oh, shoot. Well, nobody asked their question.
You know what? One thing I would say is that last night this cover won a national journalism award that hasn't been announced yet because the judging was last night. We were very proud of that cover. This cover is an environmental justice story. You can see at the top there are lots of trees, and at the bottom, an urban neighborhood, there are fewer trees, and it just talks about the impact of lack of trees on the sort of heat and the impact that has on communities.
Let's stop recording.
And again, we're reimagining our multi-platform storytelling. This is the story that I referenced about Katie.
When you go through something like this, there's not much you take for granted anymore.
This is her story.
That's great.
King's New Face. Premiere event next Saturday at 9 on National Geographic.
So that was the documentary. This was the magazine story. That was before. That was before. So this picture was a whole ethical, an intense ethical conversation. Whether we should publish it.
I think we're going to be able to get into a lot of this in a Q&A session. So if you finish your deck, and then we can open it up. And
Okay. Lots of.
We can do some real talk once the camera's off. You know what I mean?
We've done whole sessions just on this story.
I bet.
But we'll come back to it. And then a final point, not final, but next to final, creating an inclusive culture. So we did a special issue on women in November 2019. We did a book on women. This is a cover of that book. We did about 50 digital stories to support that coverage. We sent writers around the world to do stories about women around the world. We did a story about girls' education in Rwanda. We did a story about women in India organizing themselves to fight back against violence. That was a really powerful issue that came out just a couple months before the pandemic. But we had a whole sort of national tour plan that was going to go with the women's issue that was put on hold because of the pandemic. And so this is how Nat Geo used to write about women's issues. And now we have, empowered women, working women. This young woman was graduating from Spelman College in this picture. You know her?
It's crazy.
And this is a woman in the military carrying a man. It's part of her training. And this was the cover of that issue. You probably recognize some of these women. So you see like that, the woman on the bottom right was a sort of, woman of yesteryear from the National Geographic image collection, which has millions of pictures. Jeff, do you know how many pictures the image collection has? Millions and millions. And then we have already looked at this. National Geographic has a hub on its website that's National Geographic Race in America that has many of the stories that I referenced that we've done. And then it's also important for us to know who we are. So we know where our lane is and the kind of stories that really are us and that we should be leaning into and that we feel like we can tell in a way that's going to be extraordinary. And so we invest a lot of energy and effort into those stories. And so again, one of those is animals. There's a photographer, Joel Sartori, who is committed to photographing every species on Earth. He's past 10,000 and continuing, and these are some of those images. And these are some of the covers. And then one thing I would say about Joel's, well, I'll hold up on that story. So in January 2021, like January 2020, we did photographs of the year. I have a copy of 2020, which has the monument in Richmond that has come down in the back. In 2021, we did 4 covers that really focus on COVID, conflict, conservation, and climate change. And these 4 covers represent those stories. another Nat Geo video. All right, I'm over. Any animals writers in the house, editors?
Oh.
And so this gets us to where we are now, and that's the March 2022 issue. So I talked a little bit about Michelle Norris being one of the 2020-21 Storytelling Fellows. Tara Roberts was another 2021 Storytelling Fellow, and she wanted to write about an organization called Diving with a Purpose that searches for lost slave wrecks. But she wanted to do a podcast. So there's a 6-part podcast that's out now. It's called Into the Depths. The podcast dropped in, the first episode dropped in January, and we just wrapped up the last of those. This is the March magazine cover story. Tara's the first Black woman in Nat Geo's 134-year history to be on the cover. There have been other Black people on the cover. The oldest living World War II veteran was on the cover some months, I guess last year, and there's a copy of that in the back as well. So there have been other people of color, but there's never been a Black woman until this month. And so this story has just resonated, and we are particularly proud of it.
What an incredible way for us to wrap up this first day of widening the pipeline. So I'd like to take this opportunity right now to give a warm thank you to Deborah Adams Simmons. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing the work that National Geographic is doing and you're doing to redefine the narrative.
Thank you so much for inviting me.